Welcome to The Thin Line, the podcast for first responders and veterans. We are so glad that you are here and excited that you could join us. The Thin Line podcast is rated explicit and viewer-listener discretion is advised, as some topics may trigger suppressed or repressed memories or experiences. We encourage you to reach out and seek the services of a competent mental health professional if needed. Please take care of yourself and take care of those around you who may also be enjoying the Thin Line podcast. The views expressed on the Thin Line are unique to the speaker's personal experiences and circumstances and do not reflect the views of any specific broadcast media or platform or any specific agency. But for now, just relax, take a deep breath, and connect to this episode of the Thin Line.
Good evening, everybody. It's me, Messy Jessie, coming on here with the Thin Line. And I am so happy to introduce my co-host, my every being of sisterhood I can ever imagine.
Hi, Jessie. It's me, Colleen. I put my name back to my real name since we're back on our own show.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird to go by my real name. I've been SOS for so many years.
I know. Well, it's okay.
It's okay.
You're
and I'm here to introduce a very good friend of mine. And Brian. Brian was in the Army National Guard, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome.
And and he has some crazy stories he's going to share with us. And then talking about that, like transitioning to having to deploy, because a lot of people think that only, like, if you're not in the military, just the Army deploys or the Marines or whatever. The National Guard usually goes out there first. And you certainly did. You were out there, and let's talk about your deployment and what it was like and coming home and all of that craziness.
Yeah. So the interesting part about my deployment is that it wasn't necessarily what I would call, since we were there in 05, 06, we were actually like the fourth rotation into Iraq. And so what we noticed is that over time, that the deployment, we actually noticed, because I looked at this when I was in Iraq, is that they actually had what they called SIGINTs, and which are significant intelligence actions inside country. And so what we found is that by the time we finished deployments, the number of SIGINTs, i.e. Bombs or, people shooting or mortar or rocket attacks, were actually the same number as Detroit was. And so we were starting to see where the action inside of Iraq during the time that we were being there was actually starting to normalize while we were there.
That's kind of scary, though, Brian, just to think about Detroit being that same level of violence.
Right. And so
Wow.
if you look at it, it's just that if you look at, Detroit with bombs and rockets and stuff like that. So it was more, but it was still about the same number.
Oh, so the number of incidences versus the size and scale.
Correct.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Totally.
Okay, you're in the Army National Guard, and so the National Guard, are you to explain it for the audience if they don't know, are you full-time National Guard, like full-time Army, or are you weekends? How does that work?
At the time, I was the weekend warrior.
Okay.
And I was the executive officer for the 792nd Chemical Company. And what we were was a chemical company. Basically, the mission we were trained for was to go into a country and to provide basically chemical reconnaissance work. So if an enemy, used chemical weapons, we would go out and we were trained to go and do reconnaissance to find out where it was, how bad it is, and then inform the commander so that they could then make informed decisions on the battlefield on how to react to that. And we would also provide chemical decon operations, which kind of felt I asked for the job, and because it very succinctly dovetailed into what I do for a living, which is chemical cleanup. I work for the government. At the time, I was working for the state of Washington, and I did, chemical waste cleanup, for environment. And the interesting part is that when the balloon went up and we knew that we were being deployed, it actually turned into a year and 5 month deployment time frame. And this was actually kind of normal for National Guardsmen at the time, because whereas a active Army unit is constantly training and is constantly ready to deploy, they only need a very short time for mobilization to be able to deploy into theater. Unlike a National Guard unit, they need about 4 to 5 months of train up to get you into your role, because as a weekend warrior, you're not always doing your mission, so to speak. And for us, we were actually being retrained to perform a different mission. We were doing what's called a Sec 4 mission, which is shorthand for security force. And during our deployment, we were tasked with performing three portions of the military police mission, hence the security force mission. And what that entailed was we would do convoy security operations. We did base security operations as well. And then last but not least, which was probably the main part of our mission, we did detention facility operation. And so it was a lot of work during that 4 months. We were lucky in the fact that Lewis, the mobilization station that we were deploying from for this 4 to 5 month train up period, was actually only a couple hours of home for most people.
Yeah.
So about 2 or 3 times during mobilization, we were actually able to go home and see our families, which was nice.
Yeah.
And
you had children through when you
Yes.
deployed. Yeah. Okay.
I had 3 at this time.
Okay.
And I had my 4th after I returned back from Iraq.
Okay.
And
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking, so how did you prepare your family? I mean, obviously your wife knew what to expect, but how did you guys prepare your little family? It's like, hey, daddy's going away for a little while. Do you guys kind of shelter them and tell them very little stuff, or are you honest and say, this is what we're doing?
I was honest. However, my oldest child at the time was 6 years old.
Oh.
And then I had my next one was 4 at the time. And then the next one below that was like, let me see, Thomas was born in, he was born in like 04. So, he was only like maybe 2 years old.
Yeah.
I did kind of, for lack of a better word, use my church to help my family. And I belonged to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so we had really good friends that came over and helped out my wife, do like heavy lifting or other things that she needed, and would check up on her, each week while I was gone. And her family also is close by. They were like 5-6 hours away, and they would come and visit and stay and help with family and kids and whatnot too. So we had an okay support system. And while we were there, the craziness kind of came from deployment itself. During mobilization station, it wasn't super stressful, other than just making sure that people, get to their training. And the interesting parts is that you find out the difference between National Guard and active Army is that, like I said before, everybody does their mission in active Army. As executive officer, I found out that a lot of the people in the headquarters unit, i.e. the people that are doing like your admin work and especially the maintenance folks and supply, they don't always do their jobs even as a weekend warrior because like for example, a motor ops, they would actually flag a vehicle as having a maintenance problem, and then somebody else would come in during the intervening month, pick up the vehicle, go fix it, and bring it back. And that's the way National Guard works because you just don't have time to fix it. And so here's my motor sergeant. He was an excellent mechanic. He actually worked in that second tier facility. And the problem was is that he was so used to turning the wrench himself that he had a hard time making the transition to motor sergeant, the guy who's supposed to be pointing and telling others what to do. So what would happen that we found was is that he would then, when we deployed to Iraq, he would actually start to turn wrenches himself, and then all of his subordinates are watching him do the work, and he was behind, even though he was an excellent mechanic. So then, because I was a newly minted XO as we deployed in, I didn't all know what I was supposed to do either. And so I then had to train myself up on what it was to be an XO, how I was supposed to view these reports, and how I was supposed to manage the people inside of the headquarters company, and then move forward to then mentor them on how to do their stuff. Because there's the fun stuff, like the motor sergeants get to do the dark side, as we kind of term it, because your parts don't always come in like they're supposed to. And so what they do is they make working relationships with other motor sergeants, and they don't tell me about this stuff because I'm not supposed to know as the XO. And so when they don't have a part, they'll actually go make a deal with this other guy who does have it. And he'll say, but I need this other part. And they'll make a trade. And all of this is being tracked by their Allsbox, i.e. a computer system that tracks all of your vehicles and their maintenance and stuff like that. And they'll actually create a fault, a fake fault, so that they can use that part. And then they, for the part they're giving or trading, and then they'll get that other part and they'll magically make the other problem go away, in the old system for the part that they fixed. And they call it playing the dark side, but it's stuff that you have to do. And so you had those kind of things going on. When we were there in Iraq, some of the other interesting things, and this is where I kind of get to the part where I say, telling Colleen when we were at work, it seemed like the things that could happen happened, either to our unit or one of our side units at the time. And it was like out there stuff, the stuff that you think it only happens to the jarhead on the movie, and I had one soldier who came back from her 2 weeks of leave, in the middle, and she literally came back telling me that her husband had told everyone that she was dead and was already developing a relationship with somebody else.
Oh my
she was
God.
in
country. You're over there deployed away from everybody that you know and love. And
that is like the worst.
It is. And
the worst
we had
betrayal.
another soldier in a sister unit come out of the closet, and then we had another poor soldier in the same unit. They actually killed one of their own members of their unit when they were clearing a weapon. When you come back from a mission, you clear your weapon into a sand-filled barrel, and to make sure everything's clear. And what he did was he actually turned the weapon to the side as he was clearing it and looking into the chamber. And when he let go, it chambered around that he didn't see, went off and went straight through the side of his unit member, and it was horrible. And we had to deploy, all of that stuff. We had, other members of our unit that would get into fights. It was kind of funny. One guy We called him the Punisher, because he got into a fight with one of his, his roommate. We had, a lot of, because we were a um, mixed, uh, co. What's the fun word when you have both men and women in the same unit?
Co-ed.
Co-ed. We were a co-ed unit, and so before we deployed, we had a record number of births from women, and they were moved out, and that's fine. Um, and then we brought in a lot of people that were um, not from our unit but wanted to deploy again, and so they could get all of the benefits from deploying again. And so then during, deployment, I, as the officer, actually told my people, look, if you're, I'll listen, but once you tell me certain things, I have to do something. I am the officer. And so, it kind of turned into the, don't ask, don't tell kind of policy.
Yeah.
And
There's some
I knew
things
that,
you just don't want to talk about.
oh yeah. I mean, we even had one guy, his girlfriend broke up, and we thought he was going to be the stellar soldier because he was a bodybuilder and he was really pumped up and everything. And then he literally turned into a mess after his girlfriend inside the unit broke up with him. And we had other people that we thought were going to be great, older people. We promoted them sergeant inside of Mob Station, and then they could not handle the stress. I mean, literally grabbing their head like this, can't handle the stress, during training, pointing their loaded weapon during training exercise at their own soldiers because they weren't aware of what was going on. And so the people that couldn't take the stress inside of the platoons, they would come to me in the company headquarters unit, and we would find them things to do. And then, of course, they would take our stellar soldiers in the company unit and put them back out into the platoons, which was great for them. But then they would wonder why it was that they weren't getting stellar service from headquarters.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, stealing the best, right? Yeah.
Right. And at the same time, we had other problems because our battalion command wasn't a real battalion. It was a brigade liaison detachment. And so they were actually trained to be medical support personnel for a medical brigade, doing like MASH unit and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
Instead, they were being reassigned, like we were, a National Guard unit, to be our brigade group. And so then they taxed each of the units underneath them to provide soldiers to them so that they could actually function and provide us the services that we need, which was made our lives more difficult. And so, and then as each of the wonderful things would happen, within, like let's say, we had this one where the comics would come, and do the comic show while you're in country, which was great. We had Carrot Top. And but then the other units, that are providing that, then tax each of their subordinate units on the base to provide people for security, setup, takedown, and stuff like that. And then that would take even more people from us. And so what we ended up doing was this constant day by day justification of the work that we had so that they would leave us alone, basically. And it was really stressful. On top of the fact that the facility that we're running, and I'm on purposely being vague about some of this, because my mission was classified, and I'm gonna kind of bring this up a couple times, during this interview, is how a classified mission actually affects the soldiers. So, for example, when we first deployed, I could not tell my family where I was. We actually told our family that we were at Camp Stryker on the Baghdad International Airport, which we were next to. And so all of our letters and everything that we sent home said Camp Stryker. It wasn't until about halfway through deployment that we could actually tell our families that we were at Camp Crocker, which was a detainment detention facility. It actually became one of the detention facilities that they moved some of the soldiers, or not the soldiers, but the detainees from Abu Ghraib when they were shutting it down.
Mhm.
They were
Mhm.
parsing out parts of the soldier or the detainees and the units stationed at Abu to these other detention facilities that they had in country. Ours is one of them. And they built Camp Remembrance while we were there. And another unit came in and manned that. And so we had, construction that the BLD was running, us, with this high value detainee facility that we were operating. And just to kind of give you guys the idea, a high value detainee is basically people with um, leadership knowledge. Like, for example, they might know about who was running, terrorist operations or
Mm.
the upper echelon kind of things. Those were there. Also, political people could be a high value detainee. Uh, Basically, anyone who had, good knowledge that was actionable, by the military.
Mhm.
And so, and this is where the real pressure came, is that the facility, because of the nature of the detainees themselves, was to the point to where if something went wrong at the facility, it literally went to international news and the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
we had that level of a microscope on the soldiers every day.
Well, especially after what happened at Abu Ghraib. How do
Mhm.
you say it?
Abu Ghraib,
That'd be
Ghraib?
great.
yeah.
Yeah, especially after what happened there
Oh yeah,
and the photos and everything that came out, and now you guys are really under the scrutiny of of the eye of the media.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And and so there was a lot of those things going on. Um, it was you know it was stressful. And then I, as the officer, was managing this, day in and day out. And so the daily life of the officer is, the 12 to 14-hour workday, 7 days a week, which took a toll. Um, for me, it literally turned into burnout. And so I was suffering burnout while I was deployed. And I lovingly developed what I called the zombie stare. I would come in and sit at my computer and literally sit there for half an hour, 45 minutes, sometimes longer, thinking through all of the different things that I could be doing that day that I could actually finish or get something completed or wouldn't get shot down by leadership. And then I
Mhm.
would go over and go do that thing and manage my people and check on them and things like that. And I was making sure that they were protected, and that they would get like a day off, so that they could rest, recuperate, whatever. But I, as the officer, didn't get much of that. And so I literally had the radio on 24/7, just in case they needed me, and in case something happened. Um,
Mm.
some of the other interesting things was like when the sandstorm came through. Oh my gosh, it literally was just like the Hidalgo movie. You see this literal wall of red dust and sand coming in, and you see it coming. It's like, oh my gosh, and
Yeah,
there it is. I can't believe that.
that would scare me.
Oh my gosh. And so then everybody goes inside. And guess what happened? No terrorist activity, no shots, no nothing. They didn't
They
even do
don't
it.
want to be out in it either.
No,
Your weapons
no.
wouldn't work in that kind of sand, would it? Like, I mean,
They might get a few shots off, but
everything's
you
going to
see what
jam up, you would think.
you could
Wow.
barely
Like,
see what was going on at the end of your arm in that kind
yeah,
of a
no.
sandstorm.
No,
And,
thanks.
and
What do
and you
they
could
call those?
literally lose your way.
They have a certain name for those sandstorms like that.
I don't
Because
know.
every once in a while they'll go through Arizona. When my friend
Mhm.
lived down there, it's just that wall, and
Yeah.
it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you're sitting there in your building and you're watching it kind of puff around the door frames. Everybody would do all of these little impromptu things, like we would take duct tape and we would literally create flashing on the doors because they didn't fit right, in order to mostly seal the door so that the sand wouldn't come in and get everywhere. Because otherwise, you had to sit there and literally once or twice a month get the canned air. That was like precious stuff in country, so that you could actually blow out all of the electronics so they wouldn't overheat and burn up and whatnot. It was just weirdo stuff.
Wow.
Did you ever see any camel spiders?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask that.
I didn't. We didn't have a lot of them. We actually had snakes, because the snakes would because of all the concrete. They actually made all of these concrete, walls, literally kind of like giant versions of your, the concrete bumper things that you see on the road, to block off the lanes in the middle and whatnot, that are portable during construction. They had those, except they were like, 20 feet high. And then they would put sniper screen on top of them so that they couldn't see what we were doing. And then they would have guard posts on the top of them and whatnot. And what would happen is how you got that channel along the base, the snakes and the mice and things like that would get in there, and they would catch, 8-12-foot snakes and stuff like that.
No. And I'm sure they're all venomous over there.
Yeah. And though we did have great friends with the geckos. We would sit there and climb on the walls at night, and they were fun to watch. And we loved them because they ate the flies. Oh my gosh, the flies were not like what we have here. I mean, the fly will buzz around your face here. It's like, okay, that's enough. The flies over there were like suicidal. They would literally fly at any orifice and go in it. So they would go like right at your eye, in your eye, up your nose, in your mouth, in your ear. It was bad.
Oh my gosh.
Different breed of fly.
That's terrible.
Yeah. And so, and then you had the heat. The heat was really bad. We actually got issued gloves. At first I thought, why am I getting gloves? It's going to be Iraq. Why would I wear this? Until you find out that in a 120-degree heat during August, it would get up to 130 plus. And the vehicles were so hot, it would literally give you, second-degree burns if you put your hand on it, your bare hand.
Oh my gosh.
They would actually make the vehicles so that red lines, meaning they're inoperable if you don't have a functioning air conditioner, because the inside of the vehicle would turn into an oven, almost literally. It would get upwards 200-degree plus inside the vehicle without the air conditioner.
That's terrible.
And so, and then, especially when at the time we were adding all of this up armor and things like that, and which just increases, the ability for it to turn into an oven.
I complain about summer around here. And I'm like, this is too hot. I don't know. How did you guys deal with that? Like, mentally, that had to play a lot in how you guys, dealt with things day by day. It's crazy.
It kind of similar to the sandstorm. During the hottest part of the year and the coldest part of the year, there was actually very little terrorist, bombings and things like that, because it was so hot that they didn't even want to do anything outside.
Yeah.
It was just oppressive. I mean, it was literally 120 in the shade.
That's
and you lived in, was it tents? Like, is that like MASH units tents?
When we first came into Kuwait, we were in tents. And I've got a funny story. This one, Colleen's heard this one, but it's really funny. Oh my gosh. So when we first deployed into Iraq, they all teach you, oh yeah, you got to hydrate. Everybody hydrate. You drink. And so at first you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is really true. I don't even need to go to the bathroom. I'm sweating and this, that, and the other. And golly, it's true. I need to hydrate. And then you go to bed and they're literally these tent camps where it's like whole, you know, literally a quarter-mile square is nothing but tents. And that's where what we're in Kuwait, as we acclimate to the climate and get used to doing that, because you know you're resetting your body clock and getting used to the heat and so on and so forth. And so, but what happened is that very night, I found out my body clock didn't change yet. And so my body clock told me I needed to go to the bathroom. And so I wake up at 2 a.m. And it wasn't the, oh, I need to go to the bathroom. It was the, oh my gosh, it hurts so bad. I feel like I'm going to explode. I need to go to the bathroom as I wake up. And so I'm literally jumping out of my rack, and I need to get to the nearest John. And the problem is that it was all the way I was in the middle of Tent City, and it was all the way at the end of the tents. So I'm sprinting, hoping that I'm not the kind of person that explodes halfway there. And then I finally get there, and I go. And it's like,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, oh my gosh, it was almost euphoric. And that happened 2 or 3 more times that night. And it happened like that for the next 2 or 3 days, like that. It was bad.
So Brian, how many times did you get to come home on leave?
Once.
Just
Oh,
once.
wow.
Yeah, everybody got one dwell time. If you were lucky, you were nominated and you were able to go spend a weekend, 4 days in Qatar on a leave. And so as I was suffering burnout, my commander was nice, and he sent me to Qatar, and it was a nice break. But then afterwards, I was relieved as XO, and because this was about 6 months in, and then they placed one of the other lieutenants as XO, and I became the S5. They kind of made up a job for me, and so I was in charge of the interpreters that we had stationed with us. And this is where things kind of start taking, I don't know, for lack of a better word, a more, kind of dark turn. Because as I was working with the interpreters, I start to see, other things. Like, for example, my battalion commander being deferential to our detainees, literally nudging soldiers out of the way to greet a detainee. Or, him giving preference and deference to a interpreter that was then using that to, throw their weight around and tell us what to do, the soldiers. And it was hard because we were in charge of the health and welfare of these detainees. And routinely each day, these detainees are getting checked out by the interrogators. And so what we then had to do was literally do a once over on the person to say, is this person healthy, fed, whatever? And then we turn them over. And then at the end, we do another inspection of the person. Everything that went in and out of the facility was monitored. And so the interpreters that I was in charge of would read all of their messages. And so because they were allowed to send Red Cross, letters out, and they had to read them and interpret them. They were allowed to receive visitors. At the time, we were instituting the BATS, the biological identification system. And at the time, it actually caught some more terrorists. So as they came to, visit their family members and whatnot like that, we would then detain them because we knew that they were also part of, whatever and whatnot. And so, it was just difficult, because we internally would call it the circus, because weekly we would have generals from all over theater come to visit our facility.
Wow.
And so each of those generals is then bringing with them, their wonderful ideas, because this is the thing. Everybody wants to see what we called the circus, and they want to touch it. They want to affect it. This way they can then say, I was part of it, and can then put that cap, that feather in their cap. And so I'm briefing generals, on a monthly basis, and telling them what to do, or not what to do, but telling them what's going on. We actually had scripts that the soldiers would memorize so that they would know how to interact with the generals as they came. It was stressful, having to deal with that on top of, the Pentagon and the news and everything, normal, operations that we had to deal with.
I can imagine too that you probably saw a lot of, PTSD in your soldiers. The stress has got to be tremendous, even if you're not in a firefight every day. The stress has got to be tremendous.
Yeah, we had soldiers, we didn't recognize it as much while we were in. It was more something that we noticed after, and so I'll kind of get to that, but some of the families kind of stuff and how it it affects you is like, for example, I had to schedule my calls with my wife while I was deployed because of this huge time difference. It was actually kind of a burden for her because she would have to get up at dark 30 because it's like an 11, 12-hour time difference than I'm at. And so the phone place only works, during the day for us soldiers. And, but at night, it was like at night for them. And I only get 20 minutes at a crack. And I only get that a couple times a week, maybe. And then it's email. And the gut-wrenching part was when my wife was telling me on the phone that she actually had a picture of me on the wall next to the kid's bed, and she would have the children kiss the picture of dad goodnight. And that was like, oh my God. And I get to hear the stories of what's going on. I was thankful that nothing, serious, super serious, happened, because I had a diabetic daughter. My first daughter was diabetic, and and she had to deal with that, and while she's going to school, as well as taking care of other kids, and doing the normal, shopping and everything else. It was hard.
Yeah. What was it like coming home on leave, knowing you had to go back, and how long was your leave?
The leave total was 2 weeks, and that's including your travel to and from. And so you really got to spend like a week and a half at home.
Okay.
The soldiers that did better, this is back to the ones that kind of hooked up, they would just happen to schedule, the guy and the gal going to the same place over in Europe. And then, and they would do their thing and come back, and like wonderful. And they got more of the 2 weeks because they went so close, it was only like a couple-hour flight away. But, those of us who went stateside, it was like a 14-hour day, trip home, and then another 14-hour day trip back, plus dwell time, plus, so you basically lost like 2 to 4 days just going home.
Oh, wow.
It was kind of vacation-y, because I didn't have any real responsibilities. I spent time with family doing stuff, eating out, doing stuff. It was almost like going on vacation, which is, I guess, the way it's supposed to be. And then you go home. I wasn't home long enough for my body clock to change so bad, so I didn't have any more of those, wonderful moments, and other things. And I also was intentional. I scheduled mine during the 130-degree weather, and so I missed a lot of that, and missed some of that. And so, other than that, another interesting story is during the winter. Their winters are different than here because it didn't really get like cold. And so what would happen is they would get like a really bad rainstorm. And so what would happen is that because the soil was so fine, it was basically clay, and you would get these ginormous puddles everywhere. And walking through it, it was really sticky. And so you would literally gain stature. And you would gain like an inch or two in height because of that much mud was caked to the bottom of your boot.
Oh, wow. That would
And-
irritate me. I
mess.
feel like.
Oh yeah. And so then they had to have these scraping stations everywhere, all across everywhere, so that you wouldn't track it in anywhere. And so you can get that gunk off your boots. And you had to then be careful because you could, if you didn't change your boots out every day, because your boots would literally get kind of soggy from having the mud caked onto your boot all day. And so you would take them off and let them dry out. And then you would put on another pair of boots for the next day so you don't get trench foot. And,
Oh, yeah. That's what I was going to say. Trench foot.
yeah. And so everybody had like 3 or 4 sets of boots outside of their doors drying out, you know, and so it was just the way we worked. And, you know, and then it was really dusty. They actually had to have water trucks because during the summer, the water trucks or the fine grain soil would get almost powdery like flour on the ground, and it would turn into dust everywhere. And so they had to have water trucks go through and spray the roads to keep the dust down. And then during the winter too, because it was only like 60 degrees, but because it's so muggy and muddy and nasty, again, the terrorists and insurgents didn't do any as much during that time of the year
So
either.
the fair weather terrorists.
Yeah.
That's interesting because when you watch the news, it's like you think that they're constantly doing something every day, but it's not the case. You know,
They were doing stuff. It's just that it wasn't around our base, you know, and so they were doing it like in Baghdad itself, or you know, to that convoy over there, or what have you. I mean, and some of the stuff that they were doing was literally ingenious. I mean, it was brutal. Wow. Some of the add-ons that we had to put on our vehicles, like one of them was where they would take like an angle iron. It was kind of like that, but it was like 3-4 feet long, and they would attach it to the turret at an angle, and then they would carve out of it a hook at the top of it and sharpen it. And the reason why is because the terrorists were actually putting not razor wire, but a thin piece of wire in the overpasses, and they would string it up to try and decapitate the soldiers as they would in these turret positions. And so they would put it there so it would catch the wire and cut it so it wouldn't decapitate the soldier.
Jeez.
They would then also try and drop grenades down into your vehicles as they pass by. So then they would construct like little, you know, cages over the top so that it would, you know, the
Bounce
grenade would bounce off of it and not go in, you know, and kill everybody. Or they would mount windows inside of the turrets and other things in order so they could actually see out but not have to stand up, be exposed. And or other ones, they would put like other things out in front of the vehicle to trigger IEDs in front of the vehicle before the vehicle passed over it, so that the explosion would happen in front of the vehicle instead of under the vehicle. And so we were constantly coming out with those and equipping them to our vehicles and doing a lot of that stuff. I mean, we were having to be just as ingenious as the terrorists were.
Yeah. Wow. So how did you handle your kids and your wife when you came home and leave? How did they handle, you know, let's say, for instance, your child was being naughty and mom has had it, you know, and you are like, you need to listen to me. Have you ever had that where they just look at you like, you're gone most of the time. Why are you even telling me what to do?
Yeah.
You know, I've heard that in other families that I know, that when they come home, it's like, there really is no, you're not you're still the father, but you don't
Mhm.
have that role of telling me what to do, you know,
Right.
because you're gone all the time. How did you handle that?
And so I'll kind of lead up to that. And so my experience with, um, coming home was, or I should say, my perception of that experience was flavored by my father. My father was a career Navy officer, and so he routinely went out on ship, and he would come home. And so what I noticed as a child when my father would come home off of ship, I would have that butting of heads and my father reasserting himself and whatnot like that. And I'm the boss and whatnot. And so I would notice that for about 2 to 4 weeks. So I figured when I was getting ready to come home, I figured if I can just make it past the 2 to 4 weeks, life will be good. And I thought to myself, as I'm getting ready, as we're making the transition home, the Army puts you through reintegration training like 3 times. We actually went through reintegration training before we left theater, and then we went through as we were going back to Kuwait to transition for our flight home. We got it again. Then when we got to Fort Lewis, we got it a third time.
Is that like a
And-
debriefing, basically?
Yeah, and you're wondering, what do they think we're going to do? Go postal on all of our families or something? Because that's what they keep telling you. Just don't take it out on your family. Don't beat your wife. Don't beat your kids, and whatnot like that. And so and so it's like, what's going on here? And so I get home, and I make it past the 2 weeks because the first month home is all of your saved up leave. And so when you get home after, you're making 2 days of leave like you do in the military, like normal, but because you're National Guard, they have to cash all that out. And so we cash all that out. I get a month of leave before I have to go back to work or anything else. And I'm at home, and it's again like vacation, because there wasn't a whole lot of that. My wife was used to it and whatnot like that. And so what I found, I didn't have as much problems with the kids because again, they were still young and whatnot like that. It was more the issues with my wife and what they didn't tell me in all of these briefings is that, it shows up about 3 to 4 months after you come home. And so that's when, by this time I've had the fourth briefing, on reintegration with your family. And it's like, golly, what's up with this? And then I finally run into it. And my wife was basically making decisions without me. And she was used to making all of those financial decisions, for the last year and a half that, it wasn't that she was trying to be mean. It was just that she was so used to doing it without me that it was doing that. And then she was making family decisions without me, and it kind of came to a head, at one particular point. And she wanted to, get rid of, all of these children books that she didn't like. And she started burning them and whatnot like that. And I found myself wanting to treat her the way I was treating my leadership inside of Iraq. Because at one point, I literally had to protect my soldiers. I had to do I had to basically undermine my leadership. What happened is at one point, my battalion commander came up with this wonderful idea to allow the detainees to build a mosque inside of the detention facility. And I was advising my commander, this is not a good idea, sir, because the rules of war at the time, we were not allowed to enter religious edifices at all, ever. And so if the detainees decided to refuse to come out,
what are you going to do?
it would literally make international news because we would be the next soldier, because it wouldn't be the battalion commander. It would be our soldiers that would get burned if they went into into that structure to extract the detainees. And so my commander, basically said, "Oh no, detainees assured me that that will never happen," and he believed the detainees
Wow.
over himself
Yeah.
and the other soldiers and other commanders that were advising him the same thing.
Wow.
And so what I did is I then told my counterpart at brigade and said, "Yeah, he's wanting to construct this mosque facility on the detention facility." And they go, "Are you serious? We haven't heard anything about that. You hold tight, LT. We'll get back to you." And literally the next day, that was shot down, and I was not allowed to discuss anything with brigade for the next couple of weeks.
Wow.
And so I got basically, a little bit of, retribution from my battalion commander. And, you know, and so, there's some of that going on. And I found myself getting ready to treat my wife that way, to undermine her. That's not the way a marriage relationship is supposed to work. And I knew it.
Mhm.
And I realized what was going on within myself, that I was getting ready to do it. And so I left the house and sought help. And this is where, again, the reintegration stuff. I mean, even my battalion or my company commander, when we came home, he literally was turning into tears so many times that he was even himself calling himself Captain Puddles. And this is the man who, during deployment, his own wife cheated on him and then got a restraining order on him without his knowledge, in hopes that
Jesus.
he would break it when he came home on leave and would get arrested to prevent him, from and give her the legal edge inside of the divorce proceedings. It was horrible.
Wow.
Go somewhere else during his home visit, and he couldn't even see his own children
That's terrible.
That's
during
terrible.
during that
So
time. It was bad.
you said that you said that you did seek some help, and um I mean, it was beneficial.
Oh yeah,
I think okay.
and so I was able to meet with a veterans specialist
Okay.
that help from the local vet center, and
Okay.
they were really helpful. During this time, I did a lot of research myself on how to become more resilient and deal with the stress and strains
Right.
of what I did. And so I told Colleen this multiple times. I basically started journaling, and
Oh, yeah.
or I actually reinvigorated my journaling that I had been doing for a long time. And so I found that through journaling, I could get things out of my head and onto the paper, and it helped me to let go of things a little bit better. Um, Talking to the veteran, counselor was nice. I could talk to them all I wanted to about, home and reintegration and things like that. The problem is that I couldn't talk about anything about my mission because
Yeah.
everything is classified. It's still classified. It tends to fester inside because unless it's a fellow person that you deployed with, you can't talk to anyone about it because they
Yeah.
don't have the clearance. And um, and so it got so bad that even afterwards, I'm sitting here seeing the person, and my wife is telling me, "You don't need to see a counselor." She didn't think I needed it,
Hmm.
and I knew I did. And so I kept seeing them until things tended to smooth out again at home.
Mhm.
I became more active at church again, and that helped as well, because as you do those things, it's almost like a mindfulness kind of things. So I would pray in the morning about what I wanted to do in the day, go do what I did, and then pray about what I did and what I was grateful for. And so it was, which is similar to kind of the mindfulness. You plan out what you want to do for the day, you go do it, and then you kind of check in with yourself to
Mhm.
see what it is that you did during the day, and then
Mhm.
look for the things that went well. And even in my journal entries, I would kind of list the different things that went good and went bad and what happened. And then I would actually change some of my mental patterns a little bit by saying, oh, I guess this week went better than I thought it did. And I would actually journal that.
That's good. That's real good.
That is really good.
I would even help my kids to do those things. So we do this during the daily prayer. I would ask the kids, what are you thankful for? What do you need help with?
It
And
does change your mindset to put yourself in the mindset of thankfulness and gratefulness instead of everything's going wrong. Pick out something that's going right and focus on that. And it's hard when things are crashing down on you to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and even then, after I came home 6 months later, I get summoned back to Iraq to testify against my battalion commander. Because yeah, he basically was accused of aiding the enemy, which was like really serious. Because he was basically accused of giving his cell phone without an interpreter to a detainee to use.
Good night. Is this the same?
This is not a good idea.
The same
Is this the
battalion
same
commander
person who
that was
wanted to
actually
do
go
the
out of the
mosque?
way to greet the other detainees. Yes.
And he wanted to build the mosque?
Yes.
Yeah,
And he downloaded his SIPR computer onto CDs,
Holy
which was
moly.
now wrong because you have to keep classified information in a approved storage container, which is lockable and has all kinds of regulations. And then he was also accused of conduct on becoming an officer. He had a relationship with one of the interpreters. And then he also was accused of disobeying a direct order because while they were searching his quarters, he came back and against orders. And so he got tried, and the conspiracy theory thing happened. And so the journal or the log entries that all of the soldiers kept, that was the primary mode of evidence for his handing off the phone, was in the Afal Palace inside of Baghdad International Airport, where they have all of the things. The evidence room just happened to catch fire, and the evidence was destroyed.
What?
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So he didn't get, and so then because it became a he said she said, he wasn't convicted of that, but he was convicted of the other 3 offenses. And this was a lieutenant colonel that was reduced to private E1, lost his pension.
Wow.
And he did time in the brig, I would hope.
And he went to Leavenworth.
Yeah, that is like really hard.
Wow.
That's
unbelievable. I mean, you're there thinking that the person next to you or your commanding officer or the private next, whatever, has your back.
Yeah.
Has our back, has America's back. Wow. That
kind of makes you wonder what made him make those choices.
Yeah.
Like,
what
makes you do that? And think you're going to get away with it.
Yeah. And he was a soldier. And I mean, and then, while all that's happening, the unit that replaced us a year later was actually our sister unit. We knew them, and they were there from Washington as well. And they relieve us, and their commander does something stupid. And I see that we're kind of coming up on time, and so I'll kind of end with this story. Their commander decided to bring home a war trophy, and this was not uncommon. And where they send back, basically a piece at a time of a gun, in hopes that they will get the war trophy, the gun at home, and he gets caught, and he gets relieved from duty, and so their unit comes back commanderless, and because he's being tried under UCMJ, and so I was then appointed as their interim commander as they transition back home. Wow. And and it's demoralizing for the unit, I mean, and this is some of the stuff that they don't tell you. You know, we, the two units, were literally part of history, not just any history. This what, and not just like general history, like, you know, and I'm being vague because it's classified.
Right.
We literally were part of the history that shaped a nation, i.e.,
Yeah.
Iraq.
Yeah.
And not in the way of we were providing security or
Right.
whatever. Services that we were providing at that detention facility were literally part of what shaped Iraq into what it is today.
Wow.
And they don't tell you how stressful that is.
Yeah.
You know, you when you read in the history books about Washington, you know, walking through his soldiers and doing the Revolutionary Army, you think this nostalgic thing. But you don't think about the fact that how bad did Washington feel when he was walking through his starving soldiers
Right.
as they were trying to mount a resistance to the
Right.
British. And this is what was going on with our unit and what was going on with the sister unit that followed on. And the stress and strain was incredible. And not in the way of bullets and bombs and whatnot like that. It was this day in and day out constant emotional stress of the microscope being on you 24/7
Wow.
and from your nation and the Pentagon. And
Mm.
as I'm
Well,
working with these soldiers, you know, I told them, you're not broken. This is normal, you know, and we went through it too. And these things are not, you know, uncommon amongst those that have experienced these experiences. To seek help is not weakness. To seek help means that you actually have the wherewithal to know that you need help. If you were being tasked to pick up a piano by yourself, you would ask for help, and it wouldn't be considered weakness. But that was the load that these soldiers bore as they came home from deployment. They were literally trying to lift up a proverbial piano in their emotional mind by themselves. And for some, it was unable to lift. And so you need help. And so it's not weakness to ask for help. It
yeah.
was a sign to me of emotional well-being, you know,
Yeah.
that they do those things.
Well, thank you, Brian, for sharing all of this. This has really been, it's fascinating from somebody, I was in the service, but I never deployed. So, and it's absolutely fascinating to hear this kind of stuff and to understand a little bit more what you and so many others dealt with. Thank you for sharing this.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Really.
I hope it's benefit to somebody.
Yeah.
Yes.
Even if
Definitely
they
was.
just say, I was in that boat.
Yeah.
I was in that ship.
Yeah, I mean, because, you know, just realizing sometimes that you're not alone is help in and of itself.
You
know, and
bet.
everybody else went through those stresses and strains.
Yep. So guys, if you're out there and you're listening and you've deployed and you've done things in the military and or on these law enforcement end, fire, EMS, whatever, if you feel like you need some help, please reach out and get the help.
Yeah.
That's one of the takeaways here is please reach out and get the help. And
there's definitely no shame.
Right. No shame. So thank you, Brian. And
Thank you,
I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes.
And Jesse and I really appreciate it. And we appreciate
Thank
our
you.
audience. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, everybody.
Thanks, guys.